On this Up-Level Dairy podcast, we are talking about trends in land values and cash rent right here in the Midwest. And you'll also hear about some of the creative strategies that dairy producers are using to gain access to and acquire land for cropping, feed, and manure without having to pay that top dollar per acre. We're joined by our friends Curtis Gerrits and Jade Kruschke from Compeer Financial today here on the Up-Level Dairy podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Compeer Financial. Compeer Financial is a member-owned farm credit cooperative serving and supporting agriculture in rural America. Their dairy team brings world-class expertise and tailored solutions to support dairy producers' financial goals and lending needs.
We're here today with Curtis and Jade from Compeer. And Curtis, you've been on the Up-Level Dairy podcast with us before, but take a moment, reintroduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and what your specialty is with the Compeer team.
Yeah, my name is Curtis Gerrits. I'm a senior dairy lending specialist with Compeer Financial. I work directly with dairy producers, primarily across Wisconsin and Minnesota, also with other dairy farms located outside of that territory across the country as well. Pretty much specialize in working directly one-on-one on the financial side with dairy producers with all of their lending needs, as well as any kind of expansion planning, margin management, and just overall business trends with their dairy operation.
You are the dairy guy, so thank you for jumping back on with us here. We're excited to have you. And a new voice and a new face from Compeer with us today, Jade Kruschke. And Jade, you bring a different breadth of experience from the Compeer team to the show today. Give a quick little intro. Who are you? What do you do? And what's your specialty?
Yeah, thanks, Peggy. I am one of the appraisal regional managers here at Compeer for the appraisal team. So I have a group of 14 appraisers that I manage. We have one office here in Baldwin, Wisconsin, and then the rest of my appraisers are in Minnesota, ranging from our Waite Park office all the way down to Blue Earth, Rochester, Mankato area. I came to Compeer in 2016, or AgStar at the time, and started my appraisal journey. So I'd have been appraising for the past 8 years and recently stepped into this role about a year ago.
Okay, Jade, so I have to ask you, when you were a little girl growing up, did you say, someday I'm going to grow up and be an appraiser?
I did not. I actually had no idea what an appraiser was whenever I came to Compeer. I started my role, and within a month of it, my boss came to me and said, "So do you want to be an appraiser?" I'm like, "Can you tell me what they do?" So that's when that started.
Jade, as an appraiser, you spend a lot of time looking at farmland values and trends, and this is a hot topic for farmers across the country. So what do you see as the top dollar for land values throughout the major states that you are looking at in Compeer's market?
At Compeer, within the appraisal department, we have what we call benchmark farms. These are typically pure tracts of land that have 100% woods or 100% tillable acreage. Our team monitors these. There's 53 farms that we monitor on a monthly basis that help us to watch what the markets are doing month to month so that we can keep up versus maybe just on a yearly basis to what the market's done in that year. When I went to answering this question, I thought it would be most beneficial if I took a deep dive into those benchmarks in our 3-state territory. And safe to say that the land values range a ton from north to south and east to west across our 3 different states. When looking at the land in Minnesota, we watched 13 cropland benchmarks over there. The values placed on those here just in January of this year, so very recent, was from 4,200 up to 12,800. So as you move, like I said, north to south in Minnesota, the values drop off drastically. This is also the same in Wisconsin. We have 10 farms there that we watch that range from 6,800 an acre on tillable land all the way up to over 18,000. The 3 on the western side of Wisconsin that we follow, like more over here in my territory, they range 6,800 to 8,000. So a pretty tight range on cropland values. But the more you get towards the eastern central region of Wisconsin where we follow things there, those are 12,000 up to that $18,500 range. In Illinois is where we see our highest dollar, though, to answer your question on farm ground in the territory. We have 20 benchmarks over here that we follow. They range from $6,700 an acre up to over $20,000 an acre. The top one being 21.5 is where that benchmark sits today. Only 4 of those 20 benchmarks are under 10,000 an acre, with 8 of them over 15,000 an acre. Obviously, our territory is a very broad territory, but it gives you a good dive into where those top cropland values are, and then also how much they can range within each state of our territory.
Jade, thank you for pulling that data. And when you really lay out those numbers, it is so clear, as you said, the range. And so let's just take Wisconsin, for example. When you look at that range from 68 to 18,000 plus dollars per acre, what's the difference in the acreage, in the location? Where do you see the biggest variations coming up when we look at that dollar value and the intended use and potential use of some of those spaces?
Location plays a huge role in the price of land. So as you move north, especially in Minnesota and Wisconsin, the values do slide off in wooded tracts and tillable cropland tracts. Things just become more rural and wooded in nature as you go north. We do track wooded values in Sawyer County, which is way up north over here on my side of the state. And that's sitting at $2,500 an acre. The wooded tracts that we cover down south in Buffalo County, that wooded acre just sitting at $7,800 an acre. So even things on the wooded side of land has a big range. The 3 benchmarks we have in the East Central region continue to show strong trends of increased values. This area is heavily populated with dairy farms. So these have been the main buyers of those tracts in that particular area. Just to touch on the other portion of your question, though, the intended land use playing a huge role to the impact of the value. If the intended land use is for development, you're going to see those properties sell much more than they would if they were just being purchased for cropland. Whereas if the intended use is transitional, where development is in the near future, say 3 to 5 years, but isn't here today, we call those more transitional properties. And they're going to fall in between what cropland would be today and what development would be in 3 to 5 years, with that intended gain once it hits development in the future. But the location and the intended land use of the properties does play a huge impact on the overall all value. We see the intended land use really coming into effect over here in Northwest Wisconsin, as we're right here next to the Twin Cities. So the county where I live and the one just south of me, the land on the eastern side sells way different than the land on the western side. I mean, you might have $10,000 an acre differences just from side to side of the county because of the location near the Twin Cities.
So the disparity in those values and tying that to the intended purposes really draws out some major variation. And I know you referenced the $7,800 an acre woodland in Buffalo County, and anybody that's listening that's a deer hunter knows why that woodland has an extremely high value. That's like what, one of like the top deer hunting counties in the country, isn't it? Curtis, go ahead, jump in. You probably know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your husband can attest to that too, as he travels over this way to bag some bucks.
Absolutely. When you look at those numbers, you can't help but wonder, gosh, it's got to be a challenge to really look at cash flowing a purchase of an acre at $18,000. But let's take a moment and just pivot here to rent. So what do you see, Jade, trend wise for farmland rent averages?
So obviously, as the land values range drastically, so do the rents for our territory. So I dug through our sale database again that we had all the sales for 2024 and the first month of 2025. So of all the sales in our database that our appraisers are analyzing and verifying and calling buyers and sellers and asking these questions about cropland rents, I found just shy of 1,900 sales that they had analyzed in the past year. All these sales are over 40 acres in size, all with the highest and best use of the land being tillable cropland. So I didn't include any wooded land that we might have some rental stuff on in there. The range on these sales was from $45 an acre to $500 an acre. So let me break that down just a little bit further. So about 1,000 of those 1,870 sales ranged from 300 an acre to 500 an acre. on the rental rates, with a large majority of those sales being in Minnesota and Illinois. So that kind of goes hand in hand with where we discussed the land values, with those states being on the upper end as well. Only a small group of about 40 of those sales with cropland rents in the 3 to 500 range came from the Wisconsin territory. So this leaves about 900 sales that ranged from that $45 to $300 range, with an average about 200. A majority of that's in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and I definitely feel that and can support that for our territories here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So the overall average of all of these sales was just under $300 an acre for 2024 and the first month here in 2025. As I was digging into this, I thought, what's the trend, like you asked, over the past few years? What's that been like? So I wanted to get a good feel on what they had done over the past few years. So I went back into the sale history of our data. And what I gathered was that in general terms, land rents haven't changed much in the past few years. In 2023, we analyzed over 1,800 sales, and the average for all of those 1,800 was about $285 an acre. And in the prior year of 2022, we analyzed a similar, just over 1,800 sales, and the average was $269 an acre. So you could maybe say they're trending upwards, but from 269 to 285 to 300 really isn't a significant change there to really hang your hat on if you want to say they've been trending upwards. But in general, I would say they're hanging pretty steady there.
Yeah. Jade, thank you for doing such an in-depth analysis of those trends, current and in the past few years, when we look at values of land and also rental averages too. And one thing you just can't help but wonder as we look towards the future now and pivot to looking ahead is with lower commodity prices in our forecast, how could this impact those land values and also rent prices? And Jade, I would love for you to respond on this, but Curtis, I'm really curious to get your thoughts on this too. So Jade, what do you think?
When I was thinking about this, just like anything, your guess is as good as mine as we're trying to look into the future. I'm going to reference an article that one of our appraisers recently wrote, Diane Zellhart. She just put out on our appraisal team site and all over social medias. The outlook we're hearing around the neighborhood and from farmers in the area when we're on the farm is just more cautious. We've had a few larger tracts of land come up. People aren't jumping on top of them, signing contracts before they're really thinking things through, calling their lenders, calling their appraisers, crossing their T's and dotting their I's, for lack of better words. So people are just more cautious about the decisions they're making. I'm also cautious to say that land values have declined. I don't know that we've really seen a decline yet. But at the same time, things are just taking a little bit longer, and the good tracks are still selling well. And the ones that might not be quite so productive or have the operational utility that some others do might just be sitting on the market a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. So obviously with the future, you don't know how it's going to impact the values. But at the same time, I think people are just being a little more cautious.
And the lender in the room says, thank you for being more cautious with land purchases. Curtis, let's hear your thoughts on that.
Jade hit it pretty well earlier. It's all about location and competition, quite frankly. When we seen the big run up in grain prices several years ago, it set the bar for starting to see a lot of $300 an acre rent. And that's not just necessarily in the Corn Belt, but if you stretch north and south of the Corn Belt, you saw that rental rate increase, again, right around that $300 an acre range. That bar's kind of been staying pretty steady in that sector. But really what it boils down to is everybody's competing for land. Now, when you look at the sophistication, I would say, of dairy producers today and understanding their numbers and what they really dive into to understand their margin, what you also see is that they may take on some additional land from a rental perspective and pay a couple dollars more per acre, and in turn around and maybe let some of the acreage that they run that's further away from their dairy farm. It's not a net zero trade-off from one to the other, but they're starting to recognize that, hey, where's my money most well spent? And if I have to give something up somewhere else to diversify my risk and bring on something a little bit better and closer and convenient to a home, they're willing to take that look.
And Curtis, this actually lends to something else that I've asked you to share with us today, because you do work with so many progressive and successful dairies throughout the Midwest. And you've seen some scenarios where people have been able to have non-traditional approaches to acquiring land, for maybe it's purchase, maybe it's rent. But what I've asked you to share with us is, what have you seen, a few examples of how dairies can acquire farmland without having to pay that top dollar, that $18,000 above value per acre? What are some of those best scenarios that you've seen producers come up with?
Boy, if we had enough time, we could probably talk about the different scenarios and strategies out there for hours on end. What we're learning is that there's no one dairy, one grain operation, swine operation. There's none that are all exactly alike. Everybody has their own circumstances that they have to monitor, whether it's location, financial situation, capital that they have to insert into their business. So there's so many different ways to look at it. It all depends on the business model and what you're looking to accomplish for your business. For example, a dairy producer that I work with really focuses on their return on assets. The only acres that they own are the acres that their dairy site is placed on. All of the other areas that they have to run as far as crop ground goes, they don't have anything to do with it other than purchasing the crop from the farm. So when they're looking at the return on that asset that they've got invested into their dairy operation, from a percentage perspective, their return on their investment into their business is quite high. Now, they don't have direct control over the land. They don't have necessarily direct control over how the crops are going to turn out. But what they do have a control over is the relationship that they have with the growers in their neighborhood, that they have a contract with year over year to acquire the crops, work through the relationship on manure transportation and manure dispersal onto those lands, especially as it pertains to their nutrient management program. So for that farm, it works very, very well. Their business is milking cows and getting a good quality product, as opposed to retaining ownership or control of land. Another situation out there that's a little bit abnormal or not per the book is owning the land, but then turning around and renting it back out and purchasing the crop back from those that are renting the land from you. Now, this is a little bit outside of what would be considered normal. I get that. But when we look at their particular situation, their tax implications as it pertains to taking in a rental income and then also providing an expense, a write-off for purchasing that feedback, for that particular situation works out quite well. The relationship that they have with the neighbors who run the land in their neighborhood as well works out quite well, because that's their business model. They own the equipment, their neighbors do, not the dairy farm. And so they take on that risk. The neighbors take on the risk of owning and maintaining the operational costs from the equipment. And again, in that situation, the dairy farmer will work directly with the cows and utilize that business model to work to their benefit.
Curtis, you talk about this as like risk management. So when you're looking at this bigger picture of thinking outside the box to be able to acquire land or have access to land in some way, whether it's for manure, feed, cropping, it's peeling back these layers and looking at, okay, what are tax implications? How can we use this to manage our overall risk of our business? How can we look at generating a higher value for our owned assets? Or how can we own less assets that don't generate that value back? And so these are really specific strategies. As you talked about, everybody's got a different situation, but this is where there really is that benefit with getting very clear about what your goals and objectives are as a business, and then looking around you and saying, how can we make this work from a strategic point, from a risk management point, and from a tax advantage standpoint too?
You're absolutely right. There's no one way to skin the cat in this scenario. And again, looking at the sophistication of our dairy producers that we work with, they're honing in on the business itself and what is their end goal from running a successful operation. And for others, their plan is to acquire land. And it works just fine in that business model as well. But they set up their business to do so.
So you just mentioned that for some producers, the goal is to position themselves to acquire more land and for the future of their business. But what if you are a producer right now who actually is looking at exiting the business in the next few years and still wants to be able to capitalize on the value of their land, but also being conscientious of the tax implications that could come with a large land sale?
So you're hitting a topic that is becoming a little bit more and more common out there, what I like to call creative financing. A lot of these landowners who are looking to transition their business, sell off the land, sell off their assets. Maybe there's no next generation. So it's time to move their asset from their portfolio to somebody else's. For the most part, generally speaking, I mean, these are large transactions. And with a large transaction from a sales perspective, usually comes a pretty large tax implication. So instead of taking that large chunk of income with one false swoop of selling all of the land or a dairy operation all at the same time, what we're starting to see is some of these sellers kind of become the bank. There'll be a land contract for deed set up into place, and maybe there is a balloon maturity date. So let's say 5 years, there's stepped up payments, just like an amortization schedule with a conventional lending facility. And maybe after 5 or 10 years, there's a balloon payment where then at that time they'll take that lump sum. But not only does it help the seller from a tax implication and cash flow situation from their perspective, it certainly helps the buyer as well because they can start to arrange maybe some more competitive interest rates than what we're seeing out there, especially in today's marketplace, as well as to maybe set up some loan structure payments that accommodates a better cash flow, especially with the prices of land and dairy facilities as to where they're at today.
So if you were a dairy producer right now, Curtis, that was looking to acquire land, is that the type of scenario you would look for in your own neighborhood?
You certainly can. And you bring up a key word, neighborhood. I think it's fair to say that we like to be good neighbors to our neighbors. It doesn't matter if you live in town or live out in the country. And a thing that resonates with me on a very regular basis, because I get asked often, well, how do I position myself to buy the land from my neighbor when it's time? Or when do I get notified? Or how do I get notified first? Going back to being a good neighbor and being transparent and having good conversations and swinging in to say hello to your neighbors or surrounding dairymen is a good thing because you never know when it might come up depending on people's situation and the next generation as to when they want to transition the land that they run or the dairy facilities. So you always want to be top of the list with your neighbors. So that's another thing. You never know when something's going to come up until it comes up.
Curtis, how many times have you had people tell you that a piece of land that they've been eyeing up for years just got sold and they never even knew it was for sale? How often does that happen?
It happens pretty darn often. And I think we all could probably hear some of those stories like, boy, I see them at church every single weekend. You think I would have known that it was going to come up for sale. And they maybe already had somebody, maybe it's extended family that they sell it to. We're also seeing investment groups from outside of our territories who come in and acquire some land as they're trying to build their portfolios as well. So you never know. There's a lot of buyers out in the world today, and money talks. It really does. But a lot of times, I think the next generation or the folks that are looking to sell their operation or the land that they own to another generation, whether it's family or non-family, they're also cognizant of wanting folks to run the land that have a good reputation and have a good family and good values as well. So yes, money does talk, but so does values and relationships.
Curtis, I'm curious for you. Could you come up with three pieces of advice that you've seen, and maybe things you've even done yourself, for negotiating with landowners? What are your three tips for success in negotiating with landowners for access to rental, access to future purchase, or even, as you talked about before, opening up that door to some creative strategies to be able to have that access even without the purchase?
I would say the first thing is have an understanding of the different strategies that are out there: conventional lending, land contracts, rental agreements, how to price out purchasing a crop. So maybe you don't necessarily run the land yourself, but you're going to purchase the crop off the field. have a good understanding of how that works so that you can be the lead and you can lead the conversation with those folks who are looking to either sell or rent or deploy their land somewhere else other than their under their own umbrella. That just kind of puts you in the lead. Not that you want to bully somebody into coming into the operation, but I think a lot of the times the sellers are looking for answers as well, and they may not know how to approach a certain situation. So if you can be well rounded and have an idea as to what model might work for you and be able to give some good information to those that you're trying to either work your way into acquiring their land or running their land, it just helps to set the stage for success on both parties' end. So that would be one. Another strategy is to look yourself in the mirror. I know that might sound a little bit blunt, and what do I mean by that? But more times than not, the folks that are wanting to or have the capacity to sell or rent their land to somebody else, they're looking for somebody to do a really good job with it. They want it to be run well. They want the correct nutrients to be put onto it. We talk about soil erosion and just conservation in general and how important that is becoming. And I think if you do a good job as well, people are more apt to say, you know what, you do a really good job with your land. And I see how you've brought your crops from here to here from a yield perspective. And boy, your fields always look really good. I would love mine to look like that, whether I own it or I don't, is also extremely important. The last piece is put yourself into a position financially that you can have these conversations. It's it's a tough strategy because it's a strategy that takes a long time, especially if you've got some things to work out with and get your business into a spot where you can start to talk shop. Because it's really hard to talk rent or purchase if you don't necessarily have the balance sheet or the cash flow to do so. So have a really good understanding of your numbers so that when you are having those conversations with a potential seller or renter, a landlord, you know where your metrics fall. You know your high end and you know what your cost of production is so that you don't exceed that because you don't ever want to put yourself into a corner where you make a move and it's like, oh, shoot, I shouldn't have done that. Now you're under contract and that's a tough spot to get out of.
Well, Curtis and Jade, both of you have shared some great insights today as we look at those land values, rent values, but also some ways to creatively gain access to land so that dairies are in position to build the future that they want with the business model that works for them. And any final thoughts from either of you today?
I'll just throw in, Peggy, if anybody finds themselves in positions like Curtis was talking about, trying to position themselves to buy that neighbor's farm or move forward with a purchase and want to get to know their numbers well and want to know what those properties are valued at, feel free to reach out to any of us at the appraisal department. We have quick, easy ways to help you out and get those numbers to you as well. So I just want to throw that out there that we can help provide insights into some of that if people have questions.
Oh, well, thank you, Jade. And we'll make sure we have all the links and contacts in the show notes for the appraisal department at Compeer, as well as yours and your contact information too, Curtis. And any other final thoughts from you today?
Yeah, you know what? It's also okay to say no and to pass up an opportunity. We hear it also often that, hey, this is a once in a lifetime sale, to come to find out 5 or 10 years later, that same opportunity comes again. Just make sure it fits into your business plan. Make sure that it cash flows. At the end of the day, again, position yourself to have success. And sometimes saying no to either renting some land or purchasing land, it is okay. And again, just watch your numbers, understand your situation, and everything will work itself out.
Well, thanks again, Jade and Curtis, for jumping on with us here today on the Uplevel Dairy Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Compeer Financial. Compeer Financial is a member-owned farm credit cooperative serving and supporting agriculture in rural America. Their dairy team brings world-class expertise and tailored solutions to support dairy producers' financial goals and lending needs.